Welcome to what is a bit of a different video. Normally, all of my videos are focused around loot running, but this video comes from me having made something cool and wanting to show it off. Everything you will see in this video started from this question you see on screen. What is the best build? Now, on the current patch, you'd probably get an answer similar to one of these. Maybe some different answers if you ask around. The correct answer is that it depends. Different builds are good for different content. Different content has different needs that your builds need to satisfy. Raiding and loot running are two very good examples of this, where raiding cares very heavily about single target damage, while loot running cares very heavily about movement and area of effect, since your damage can be compensated with boons. And so that's the answer. It depends. But that's a boring answer. And so I thought, let's try to find the best build anyways. There's a disclaimer here, you don't need to worry about that. To find the best build, the first thing I thought to do was to define what a build was. Usually, when we refer to a build, we refer to a collection of items in an ability tree. Hypothetically, if a best build were to exist, it would be the best combination of items in the ability tree. Now, something interesting about Wynncraft is that the items and abilities are pretty separate from each other. Items don't usually affect whether one ability tree is better than another. This means that if we know a good ability tree, all we have to do is find the best items for it. Because of this, instead of trying to find the best build overall, I figured I would try to find the best item build overall. That way I could use it for ability trees that I already know. So what does it mean for a build to be the best? By definition, the best build is a build that is better than every other build. If we want to find what that build is, we need a way to compare builds. So this is what I came up with. Score. Each build gets a score, with the score being determined by how good the build is. Assuming that better builds score better than worse builds, the best build would be the build that has the highest score. So how do we actually come up with the score? My first thought was to just estimate the amount of damage that a build does. Here is a very simplified version of the damage formula. For my purposes, it's good enough. There's a couple of things to note. First is that elemental defenses rarely matter, so they can pretty safely be ignored. The second is that items in the ability tree basically have completely separate multipliers here. Assuming we're on one specific ability tree, we can factor out all of the ability multipliers and just focus on items. That leaves us with this, but this is of course the damage dealt in one hit, so we need to scale it to measure DPS. For melee, this formula is pretty simple. Everything we need to multiply by can be found by using the items. Unfortunately, for spell damage, the amount we do is based on our spell multiplier per second, which comes from the ability tree. The final DPS and score would be able to be found by adding melee and spell together, since they're both damage per second, but we need a way to figure out the spell multiplier per second, or at least a way to compare spell and melee damage, if we're going to use the score formula. Earlier, I said that the items in the ability tree were fairly separate, but that doesn't mean that they don't interact at all. If we want to find a best item build, we need a way to take in information about the ability tree. The way I am doing this is by adding in a bunch of modifiable values to the score calculation that can be changed depending on what the desired ability tree is. The two that I'm adding here are spell weight and melee weight. These essentially let me control the spell conversion per second in the formula. This leads to this being the final scoring formula, with these being the calculations for melee and spell damage. The nice part about these formulas is that all of the remaining aspects are able to be found solely from items, and most of them are pretty easy to calculate. Base DPS and damage comes solely from the weapon. The bonus you get from skill points is pretty easy to calculate with the skill point formula. The other multipliers pretty much only include a handful of major IDs that affect damage universally. The trickiest part is IDs, which can come from items, skill points, and armor specials. Items and skill points are calculatable, but the value you get from armor powder specials, specifically Rage and Killstreak, heavily depends on the content. Killstreak is only valuable when you can kill lots of mobs, and Rage is only valuable when you are able to play at low health. Because of this, another input is needed for Rage and Killstreak. And with that, we can now score builds. To show that it works, I made an example using two very similar builds. These are both only caring about melee damage. The only difference between these builds is the helmet. One of these helmets does nothing, and the other one lowers melee damage. As you can see, the build that has the helmet that does nothing correctly has a higher score than the one that lowers melee damage. Very cool. Also, the score of these builds is equal to the base DPSs of both of these builds in WinBuilder. That means the formula works. Very cool. So, we can now score builds. Now we just need a way to find the highest scoring build. The first option that comes to mind is to just check all of them. This would be pretty sensible, as you'd be guaranteed to find the best build by the end of the search. There's a pretty big issue with this method, though. There's just too many builds. 716 quintillion of them. Even if we could somehow check a billion per second, it would still take thousands of years to get through them all. You could try to limit the item pool, such that there are less builds, but even then the number is just far too large to work with. So I had to come up with something else. Here's the strategy I came up with. Take a random starting build and optimize it as much as possible to reach the highest score it can. From a build, you check every possible item that you could be using in the build instead of what's there now. You then pick the swap that improves the build by the most. Do this until the build cannot be improved by swapping any items anymore. The upside of this is that instead of checking a few quintillion builds, we only have to check a few thousand. Pretty good. The downside is that it might not actually find the best build. They're optimized, but that doesn't mean that they're the best overall. An optimized aftershock build will still be worse than an optimized Hadal build, even if the aftershock build can't be improved by swapping any more items. I wanted to try to mitigate that downside, so I came up with a couple of ways to do so. First, try a bunch of random builds, optimize all of them, and pick the best one that is found after a certain amount of time. The second is to optimize items by slots, like helmets, chest plates, all that, and pick the order of slot to optimize in randomly. This will lead us to explore more of the build space, which could lead to different and potentially better final optimized builds. So that's what I did. I wrote code to download the items from the API, generate a bunch of random builds, and then optimize them by testing swaps and scoring them. As a final note, I'm ignoring set bonuses because I didn't want to have to try to implement them, and I'm also ignoring crafted items because I thought it would be boring if the best build was a bunch of crafted items. So I guess the question I'm really answering is what's the best non-set, non-crafted build, but I think that's pretty close to the original question. Anyway, here are the results of the first experiment. With these inputs, I'll explain killstreak being 200% later. With these inputs, melee would have won, no spell weight, rage at 240, killstreak at 200. We get an aftershock build. Looks like tier stack, using the hive chestplate and knuckle bones. The second build was with a spell weight of 1 and a melee weight of 1/20th. This is roughly what hybrid does on some archetypes. We get a Divzer build. And the third one, with a spell weight of 1 and a melee weight of 0, this is full spell. We again get a Divzer build, but with different items, using Tesla instead of Discharge, as well as different accessories. Now, before I want to discuss anything else, you may have noticed that I was using 200% as a damage value for killstreak, when we all know it's actually 150. It even says so in-game. Well, the in-game documentation, and pretty much everything else, is wrong. If you look in-game after killing a bunch of mobs with killstreak, you'll notice that the cap is 200%. Yes, I tested it. Yes, you actually get the damage bonus. Apparently it's been this way since at least over a year ago. My old Sunstar loot run video on beta has 200% cap. It's probably been this way a lot longer. I don't think killstreak has been adjusted. But yeah, use this information as you will. Back to the building. There are a couple of issues with the builds. The first is that everything is Archer and Shaman. This is because we're comparing all classes assuming they have similar base DPS, but in reality there's quite a big difference between classes. Relics and bows have much higher base DPS than daggers, and especially spears and wands. Normally this is balanced by those classes having higher conversions and external boosts, at least for spell. Mage melee isn't very good. But here we're completely ignoring those. So how do we factor this into our formula? My solution is to give each class a weight and to multiply the final damage of the build by said weight. Now how do we find the weight? The best way would be to look at how much spell multiplier per second each class can do and base the weights off of that. Basically, how much damage can each class do compared to each other. However, what we're going to do instead is base them off of the weapon DPS. This assumes that classes are perfectly balanced, which I think is maybe more interesting for trying to find the best item build. So what I did to find this was to take a weapon that is similar for all classes. In this case, I used Kira weapons, and I compared the base DPSs to each other and used weights to ensure that the base DPS times the weight was the same for all classes. Of course, this isn't perfect. Powders and raw spell exist and benefit low base DPS weapons much more relative to high base DPS weapons, but I think it's close enough and it yields interesting results, so this is what I stuck with. So I reran the code, the new weights added, and these are the results I got. First, for a full melee build, I got Alcatraz, tier stack again with Knucklebones. For a full spell build, I still got Divzer, the same build as before. And this time I decided to see what a full spell build would look like without Killstreak, and I got Gaia. Now, most of these items are ones that I recognize, but I've never heard of this helmet before. On looking it up, it appears to be a level 63 Earth Spell helmet, which is odd. I figured Caesar would have been better, a lot more endgame recognition for being a good Earth Spell helmet. But as it turns out, this is a 0 intelligence build, and the 30 intelligence that you have to spend on Caesar is not worth the damage you get of using it over Decaying Headrest. Very interesting. Now, if you've been looking at these builds closely, you may have noticed a couple of issues with them. Issue 1, Issue 2. The health is horrible, and the mana does not sustain anything. If Yusema had perfect mana and didn't care about health at all, the builds on the previous slides would be pretty good, but we don't live in that world, so I had to make some changes to the scoring formula. So, starting with durability, how do we incorporate it into the score? Well, effective health is pretty easy to calculate, so we can just use that. But how do we compare the value of health to damage? For example, is it worth it to make a swap that doubles your health but halves your damage? Or the other way around? There are a few different ways you could answer this. Mine was to optimize for the product of health and damage. What this would mean, for example, is that a 100k DPS and 20k effective health build and a 200k DPS and a 10k effective health build are equal to each other, and that a 180k DPS and 18k effective health build would be better than both. It means our new formula is damage score times the health score, which is just effective health. I also went and factored in the base resistance of each class into the formula, so Warrior will have more health naturally than, say, Shaman. With health and damage combined, here are the results. First, a full melee build, 0 rage, 0 kill streak. I got Inferno melee. The second, full spell, again 0 rage, 0 kill streak. I got a Guardian build using Titanomachia and Crusade Sabatons. And finally, wanted to see what would happen if I set kill streak back to 200, again full spell. It's the same Guardian build, with Thunder Powders instead of Fire Powders on the weapon. As it turns out, it's a lot easier to increase the health of a build than it is to increase the damage. These builds have a lot of health. I wasn't really satisfied with this though, and so I decided to go back to the scoring formula. If these builds have too much health, what if damage were used in extra time in the calculation? Even better, what if we could control the number of times damage and health were each used in the calculation as a way to encourage more health or more damage? My solution to this? New inputs, health and damage weights. The new formula now raises the scores to the power of the weight, allowing us to control how valuable health and damage individually are to the final score. From this point on, all of my builds will be fully spell-based. I ran the experiment again, now with health and damage weights. First, damage weight of 1, health weight of 1/2, and we get a monster build instead of Guardian. Second, a damage weight of 1 and a health weight of 1/5, we get a warp build. First time we've seen an air weapon here. And finally, I decided to see what would happen if I set the damage weight to 0 and the health weight to 1. And we get a full health Guardian build, the tankiest thing it could find. Now for the harder part, mana. I chose to use mana as its own score. I could have included it as part of damage, but there's a lot of ways in which mana is different from damage, and is beneficial more so than damage in a lot of cases. You can use it to cast movement spells and stuff. But it's also less beneficial in damage in some cases, like when your archetype's damage is rate limited, like on Lightbender or most of Shaman. So this is what I did to calculate that mana score. Mana is good, but only up to a certain point. If you already sustain your spellcasting, adding more mana does nothing. So this is what I came up with. The mana score is a score between 0 and 1. The score is the percent of the way that the build is towards sustaining. If the score is 1, it means it sustains perfectly. If it's 0, it means it can't cast spells. And anywhere in between is that percentage of the way to sustaining. In order to calculate the mana score, I had to add quite a few inputs. Because the percent towards sustaining is the mana gain divided by mana loss, we need to be able to find both the mana gain and the mana loss. Mana loss is based on the base cost of each spell and the CPS at which it's cast at, so I needed inputs for both of these. I also needed an input to determine how valuable mana steal was, because this depends on how much you're main attacking. Then, I also needed an input to consider whether mana steal was valid on any attack speeds other than super slow. This would encourage tier dropping in the build, which we commonly see on mana steal based builds. Finally, the base mana regen, because some classes get extra mana from their ability trees. For example, Acrobat gets close to 20 mana per second due to weightless, in addition to the 5 base. Finally, the mana weight, which I added similar to the health and damage weights from previous sections. I ran the experiment again, using a sort of made-up spell cycle as all the DPS and base spell costs, basically based on like the average that each class casts each spell per second, and these are the builds I got. First, with a damage weight, health weight, and mana weight all 1, and mana steal 1, but only on super slow, we get a Lunar Spine build. This is the first non-mythic item. Very interesting build, using Sparkweaver and Imperial Ember Plate, and Statue. The second build is same things as before, but with mana steal as 0. And we get an Immolation build. It's been a while since we've seen Shaman. This is, well, Immolation's quite good. Another statue build. Notably, this build has very little intelligence, and it's mostly using percent cost items. The third build I tested was a damage weight of 1, a health weight of 1/2, and a mana weight of 4, and I get a Nirvana build. And the fourth thing I tested was the same thing, but with a health weight of 0, and I again get a Nirvana build, but this time using a Nomnesis instead of Dwindled Knowledge, as well as a different pair of boots. Something I noticed is that Statue was being used a lot, which is happening because walk speed isn't being factored into the calculations at all, so I went and fixed this by adding a walk speed weight and a walk speed score, similar to what I did for the first 3. I generated a bunch of new builds with that. First one here is with all of the weights at 1, and we get a Warp build. Second is with damage weight at 2 and mana weight at 4, and a half walk speed weight. Getting Nirvana build again, this time using Moon Tower though. And the third build is with a high health weight and a low damage weight. And I get an Inferno build, this time using Resurgence instead of Statue or Crusade Sabatons. Very interesting. So, are any of these builds actually any good? Kinda, not really. One of the biggest problems is building all of our mana sustain around a spell cycle that does not exist. These wouldn't really ever be able to be the best builds anyway, since they don't involve crafted, but still the mana is a pretty big issue. But I found that this program is pretty good at generating builds based on specific playstyles. On the slide and in the description, I've generated a bunch of builds that are much, much more usable than the ones generated on previous slides. First, this Sunstar Acolyte build. This is one of my favorite Shaman builds of all time, though it's definitely getting a nerf in this upcoming patch. I'll have to check for the description. I could probably make a video on this build. It's so nice for loot running. You kill challenges so fast. Second, a non-mythic build using Grand Design, trying to build around its major ID, making a summoner build. This one was pretty fun. It's not really good for anything, but it's a funny weapon, and it shows that I can use this program to make builds that are using non-good weapons. Third, this full walk speed acrobat build is another fun one to loot run with. I could probably also make a video about this one. Very fun, not very good damage, wouldn't recommend it for raids, but for loot running it's pretty decent. Fourth, a spring build. I've been raiding with this one a bunch recently. Very fun using spring and trapper. Fifth, a warp lightbender build. I just wanted to see what it would look like. You can check that one in the description. And sixth, a non-mythic build on Arcanist using Morrowind. This one got me up to around 200,000 DPS, so pretty good for non-mythic. So that's it. I've been working on and improving this over the past few months. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments. I know there's a lot of things I didn't really explain. And thanks for watching. I'm Monkey Kapaa. See you in the next one.